This one is I want to talk a little bit about the Koreans. All right. So the first group of Koreans came to America around 1890 to 1920. This Koreans were very different compared to the first group of Chinese and Japanese. They were more diverse. When I say diverse, is that they were doing other things besides farming. You know, they were farmers, they were teachers, they were miners, they were servants, they were a little bit of everything. Their education, Koreans had a higher education than the Chinese. About 70% of the Koreans, they were well educated. Some of the reasons they wanted to come to America was for they had some political reasons and some economic reasons. About 90% of the Koreans were men, only 10% were females. About 70% of them were in Hawaii. They were doing like sugarcane, stuff like that. They did the maintenance for the railroads. They didn't actually work on them, but you know, if something happened, like if it broke down or it needed to be repaired, then that's what they would do. And they were big in agriculture as well. A lot of Asians were in Hawaii at this time. Hawaii and some of them were in the mainlands as well. So they had to deal with certain conditions, which I'm not gonna say that they were. I'm not gonna say that they were the greatest conditions that they worked under, and some of the things that they had to face wasn't that great compared to today. The migration stopped in 1905 by the Japanese government, so it didn't last very long. So the Koreans who worked on the mainlands, they found work in the Alaskan canneries. They worked on railroads. They did service jobs, like they worked in restaurants, and they were servants. Some of them owned their businesses. They had small little businesses at this time. They faced a lot of discrimination at this time. You know, overall, Americans did not like Asians of any ethnic group. So when they first started coming, the first Asian group started coming to America, you know, the Americans did not take too kindly to this. They didn't like them. Same thing, they wanted the Koreans out of America. They didn't like them. Same thing with the first Japanese, first Chinese, they all wanted them out. So what makes you think it's going to be any different for the Koreans or any other Asian group? A lot of them were trying to be more westernized, more American. About 40% were Christians at this time. So I want to talk a little bit about the Korean independence movement. Japan kind of took over Korea. Koreans didn't like this. One reason why is because they wanted Korea to be Japan, part of Japan. And then in Korea, they even banned Korean language in the schools, which a lot of Koreans did not like this. They kind of developed a sense of hatred towards Japanese people. They didn't like the Japanese at all because, you know, they're losing. The Koreans are losing their culture. They're losing their identity, basically, you know, in favor to be Japanese, and they weren't Japanese. So obviously, you know, they're not gonna favor this. They're not gonna like this idea that Korea should be like Japan. They started boycotting a lot of Japanese products, you know, like soy sauce, stuff that they knew that was made in Japan. So I wanted to talk about Durham Stevens. The Japanese government hired him. He was an American employee. He worked as a public relations and lobbyist for the Japanese. One person, his name was Inhwan Chan. He was a Korean person. He didn't like him. He didn't like this American guy saying all this stuff because it wasn't true. You know, some of the stuff that he was saying to the American public wasn't really the truth. You know, kind of made Koreans look bad in a way. So he didn't like this. So Inhwan Chan shot Stevens. He became a hero for the Koreans. So a defense fund was raised in his honor, about $4,000. So basically everyone who supported him or just wanted to help out, they could donate money, and they did $4,000, which, you know, back then it was a lot of money. Inhwan Chan was quoted in saying, "To die for having shot a traitor is a glory." So he showed no sympathy towards what he did. You know, he thought it was the right thing to do. Eventually he was released from prison. This happened in 1908. He was released from prison in 1919. He died here in the States, but in 1975 they reburied him in Korea, South Korea. So I wanted to talk about the movements in America, what was going on with the Koreans during this time. They were very involved with the churches. They established the Korean schools. For the people who knew the culture, the Korean culture and the language, they kind of wanted to make schools, Korean-based schools for the Korean students to go to, and they can learn about their culture, their individual culture, and their own, you know, learn their own language, because, you know, it was banned. There was a time where it was banned, and they didn't want to lose that they didn't want to lose a sense of their culture and, you know, their pride for being Korean, and that's apart from being American as well. However, they felt that they were more Korean than they were American. Once World War II happened, when all the Japanese were interned, you know, for something that they didn't even do, you know, they were kind of being blamed for something that they had no involvement in doing. Koreans started separating themselves. There was this big division in Korea that separated the country. This is what starts the whole Korean War. So the Korean War lasted about 5 years, 1950 to 1955. North Korea attacked South Korea. They don't, they don't get along. You know, they have different views. So that's why they kind of had to split the country in half. One thing that came out of this is, you know, the soldiers who were going to Korea, they were able to mingle with, you know, the Korean women over there. And so some of the Korean women became what you call war brides. A war bride is basically an Asian woman, or let me say Korean woman, who marries an American soldier, and then they come from Korea over to America. Socially, the Koreans it was not accepted socially by the Koreans. They disapproved of this. They didn't like it. They didn't like this at all. Unfortunately, both sides had to deal with comments, you know, being that they're of two different races, backgrounds, you know, their cultures were very different from one another. They're gonna have to hear it from both sides. You know, the Korean women are gonna hear it from the Koreans. They're gonna say stuff like, you know, why are you with this? Why are you with this American soldier? Why are you with him? You know, they're not gonna like this. So they're gonna be very critical about their relationship. And same thing with the American soldiers. You know, the ones who were involved with the Korean women, they have to listen to their family and people, Americans, say really bad things and criticize them for doing this, for being with a Korean. They're gonna say stuff like, why are you with this Korean woman? Does she even speak English? And, you know, it caused a lot. You know, it's gonna cause some problems. You know, people are not, at this time, people were not accepting. They were not very open to change. They were very stuck in their ways, both Koreans and Americans, you know. Some supported it, most didn't. During this time, America kind of set a quota for the Koreans of how many Koreans could enter the country each year. They had a quota of 30 per year at this time. However, if you were married to an American soldier and you were Korean, you were a Korean woman, this didn't apply to you. For the Korean wives, they had a really difficult time coming to America. They're coming to a whole foreign land that they've never been to, so they don't really know what to expect, and they're coming along with their American husband. So this is gonna create some complications. This is gonna be very difficult for the women. They're facing a complete culture shock. It was very difficult for them to adjust, and some of them didn't speak English, or they didn't speak it well. So of course they were ostracized for this. So I want to talk about the war orphans really quickly. This happened between 1955 and 1966. There was about 6,000 at this time. So some of them for being Amerasians. What this is a kid who is half white, half Asian, or half American, half Asian. They were rejected by the Koreans. The Koreans didn't like them because they felt they weren't Korean enough. And of course, some of the Americans didn't like them either because they felt the kids who were mixed were too Korean. A lot of the Korean mothers kind of gave up. They were tired. They were tired of dealing with the stress. They had a lot of pain, dealing with this every single day. It was like a daily thing for them. They had to deal with this situation, with their kids and everything. And some of them got really tired of doing it, and they gave up. They just gave up. They couldn't do it anymore. So some of them gave their kids up. Put them up for adoption, did what they had to do. The kids in America were placed in white middle-class families in small communities, and these kids had very little contact with Koreans in general, because there wasn't very many around where they grew up. And and of course the Asians, they were considered Asian, even though that they're mixed, because of the strong Asian characteristics. Asians and blacks, we have very strong genes. So even if you're mixed, you're probably gonna be perceived as being Asian or black, even though you're mixed with white or whatever it is that you're mixed with. You're going to be perceived as one race. One of the bad things about these kids being placed with white families is that they lose their Asian culture. They lose a sense of who they are in a way. Being raised outside of your race, or that you're mixed and you're not around both sides of your family. You start growing up, not liking. You might not like the other half of your race, or you might grow up being more in favor to one race than you are the other, even though you're mixed half and half. So I wanted to talk about what happened. So I want to talk about the third wave. This is what happened after 1965. For the people who came after 1965, it was the reasons they came was for their children. They came because they wanted a better opportunity for their children to make it. They didn't want they didn't want their children to go through what they went through living in Korea. They wanted to move to America to start a better life for themselves and their family and their kids, and because the wages here were higher than they were in Korea. They made more money here. A lot of them owned small businesses, more so than the earlier Koreans did at this time, because a couple of reasons why that they liked owning their own business was they were able to hire their family. You know, the family, you kind of keep your business in the family. So that's sort of one of the reasons. The other reason was because of the language difficulties that they had working with other people. So the Koreans have a higher business ownership rate than any other racial or ethnic group in America. You know, the Koreans did a ton of different things. They owned gas stations, they owned liquor stores, they owned grocery stores, they owned wig shops. They worked very long hours though. They worked 7 days a week. Some of them worked up to 15 hours a day. The Koreans, the first generation Koreans, they sacrificed a lot for the second generation. They expected their children to attend college. I want to talk about the LA riots of 1992. A little bit of how this started. I really don't want to get too involved in this because, you know, it's horrible. These policemen, they stopped a black man, and eventually they ended up beating him. Those 4 police officers, they ended up beating this poor man, and the police were acquitted for what they did. And this is sort of what sparked the LA riots. You know, it wasn't right. You know, it wasn't right for what they were doing. The police at this time were doing some really shady stuff. You know, I felt that, you know, they obviously were, you know, they were racial profiling people. A lot of the Korean stores were in black neighborhoods. A lot of the blacks didn't like this. They didn't like going to the Korean stores because they felt like they were being overly charged for their items. But you gotta realize, these stores that these Koreans put up are like mom and pop stores. You know, things that you could get at Walmart or Target or any other big store. You know, you could get cheaper than going to a small local store like this in your neighborhood, because they're gonna charge you more. It's gonna be more expensive. I wanted to talk about the case of Sun Ja-ju. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. This case, it's a very ugly case based on what happened. You know, what started it should have never happened. You know, the person who run the store had to leave that day. The day that this happened, he had to go to court and testify against some Crips. So the mother ran the store at this time, and while she was running the store for her son, a teenager comes into the store. She's of African American descent. She walks in the store. She has her backpack on. She goes to the store because she wants to get some orange juice. Unfortunately, the Korean woman didn't think she was gonna pay for it. She thought she was gonna steal it. Arrived some conflict going on. The Korean woman, you know, kind of snatched her bag and whatnot, and I guess she felt she wasn't gonna pay. So basically, what happened is, while she was walking out, she gets shot. She gets shot and killed by the Korean woman, because she felt, I guess she didn't think that she was gonna pay for it or whatnot. And you know, both women, they exchanged some words, and it didn't go well. This got around. People were very upset that, you know, this little girl, this teenager, she got killed for absolutely no reason. So eventually, this started the whole LA riots. A lot of stores were damaged, 50 people were killed, 14 were arrested, over $1 billion in damages, and half of them were to the Korean stores. You know, over 2,000 Korean stores were hit by this, and it was just really horrible. You know, a lot of the stores did not reemerge. You know, it was really difficult for them to get back to where they were. So most of the stores did not reopen. Some of them did. About a third of the stores reopened a year later. Today, things are changing for the Koreans, the Korean family in general. You know, women play a bigger role in the economic part. You know, a lot of them are now working. They did a study in 1990s census, and they said about 60% of the women in America were now working compared to 30% in Korea. About half of the Korean immigrant women worked in the family business. A lot of the Korean daughters, they didn't like having to do the domestics. One thing that they didn't like is the fact that whenever they had a party, that the women were responsible for taking care of the men. You know, while the men were in the living room relaxing, chilling, the women kind of had to do all the work and, you know, make sure the men got their drinks and kind of serve like slaves almost in a way. You know, and they didn't like this. They didn't like the fact that they had to do all these things, but you know, it's a culture thing. So the divorce rate right now, the divorce rate was very high for Americans than there was in Korea. 3 times for men and 5 times for women. And some of the issues were that some of the men were just frustrated with their wives. You know, the fact that they work and they might earn more than the men, you know, and to them that might be degrading to them. So that could be a reason why that they divorce. Another reason is that some men, you know, they turn to excessive gambling and drinking. And probably one of the biggest reasons for this happening, you know, is for the divorce rates is because of the long hours that they worked. You know, working in this family business was not easy for them, you know. And I'm sure they probably got sick of, you know, being around their family 24/7, you know, working in the family business, seeing them at work, going home, you know, having dinner with them, you know, dealing with them 24/7. You get no break. And that must be really hard. That must be really difficult, really challenging to deal with, you know. For me, I know if that was me, you know, I'd get sick of that person being around them 24/7 all the time. You know, you need your space once in a while. You can't be around that person 24/7. It's just way too much. You know, a lot of Korean parents, they favored their kids. They did. They preferred to have a male over a female. Because for the males, they were able to keep the family name, meaning that they could, unlike women they kind of had to take their husband's name. So that's why they preferred men. They preferred men over women. During, you know, this did change, you know, they didn't emphasize as much as wanting a son as much as they wanted a daughter. But one thing that they did is that they wanted their daughters to, they favored their daughters in learning and taking a music lessons. One thing I will say is that their education was higher. For the second generation was higher. 39% of men to 34% of women went to a 4-year college. So one of the last things I wanted to talk about was the ethnic education. At home, you know, they're very Korean. They speak the Korean language to their parents and their family members. They watch movies, Korean movies. They were taught how to respect their elders. They were taught how to respect their parents. When it comes to parenting, Asians, we don't play. They don't play. They don't put up with a lot of stuff. They just won't. Asian parents will not put up with any BS. They won't put up with their child disrespecting them. They won't put up with their child acting up. You won't see that. If you go out in public, you'll never see an Asian kid disrespecting or screaming or yelling at their parents. Same thing with black parents. You probably won't see that. That we don't play. Asians and blacks, we don't play. We don't play that. We don't deal with our kids acting up like that. They're not afraid to smack them for it. Not trying to promote any type of violence or anything, but basically I'm just saying that you're not gonna see an out of control kid, an Asian kid like that. You won't see it. They're not gonna act up as much as say like as much as American kids, because the way that they were brought up, the way that they were raised, they weren't raised like that. But anyways, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Alright, so I guess I'll talk to you guys later. Alright, later.